All right, everyone. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to our class on Rabi Addai Alkhas and Rabi John Alkhas, two great Assyrians who have created incredible literature and are worthy to be discussed in this full class. And indeed, we should devote much more time to these two great men, and I'm working right now on the translation of some of their writings, additional writings. I've translated some of their writings here, but as you'll see, to share with you. But I'm also working diligently to translate a number of important works. So, Guardians of a Forgotten Past. We're going to talk about this, and we're going to ask some questions at the end, and I want you to think about what I'm going to share with you about these two great men. If you don't know, of course, some of you come to this class with previous knowledge. Either you have, as some of us, we're very honored to have some family members of the Alkhas family. By the way, you should know this name, Alkhas, its origin. It is said that, this is lore, that Alkhas is actually Al-Qas in Arabic, which means the priest. And so these are people who originated in Al-Qush, this particular family, and from Al-Qush in northern Assyria, or in Assyria, traveled to Urmia, what became later north eastern Iran, and lived in Urmia and became part of the Assyrian community there. And the name, of course, the pronunciation, Al-Qas, is pronounced Alkhas in that part of the world, which uses largely Turkic, Azari, in addition to, of course, Assyrian. There's Kurdish, but that part of the world, of course, northeastern, or excuse me, northwestern Iran. I said northeastern, I meant northwestern Iran, is largely Assyrian, Turkic, and also Kurdish. Persian is in kind of a different area in Iran. So, why do we talk about guardians and why do we talk about the forgotten past when we talk about these two great men who were brothers? And of course, John Alkhas never married and has no children, but Addai Alkhas married, and he is the father of the great Hanibal Alkhas, probably one of the greatest Assyrian artists in the history of the Assyrian people. And we're going to talk briefly about Hanibal. We're going to mention him, although this class is really focused on the great work created by, in particular, these two men, along with another team, and we'll mention their names. And we're going to try to see through their writings and their expressions and their poems and their translations, what exactly did they stand for? What were they trying to convey to their people? Now, before we begin, let's take a kind of a contextual picture and understand the period we're talking about. We're talking long after the First World War, or quite a few decades after the First World War. We're talking about Iran in the 1950s and 60s. There were major cultural and social changes in Iran. We have witnessed modernization, largely due to the efforts of the Shah, who was Iran's monarch at this time, supported by the West. There was a great deal of Western influence in Iran, and this, of course, also impacted the Assyrian people. This period saw a growing middle class in Iran. Assyrians became involved in a number of opportunities, and there was opening up of various areas. So there was also accompanying this kind of cultural opening, there was also a economic um, there was also economic benefits to people. Sorry, just getting messages here. There was nationalization of the Iranian oil industry, and this also impacted Iran in terms of greater income flow and transformation of society. There were some political upheavals, the 1953 coup d'etat of Mossadegh's premiership. This ended, the United States and Britain were involved. I'm not going to get into that, but I want you to understand that there was social and cultural and political upheaval, and the Assyrians largely stayed out of the culture, the political. Um, Having experienced the issues with communism in the 1940s, Assyrians largely stayed out of the power struggles in Iran. And as a minority in Iran, along with Armenians, the Assyrians largely favored the Shah because of the westernization and the opening of opportunities. Now, Iran is next to Iraq, of course, and they were shaped, both of these countries, by different dynamics, and there were external influences on both of them. Shah had been an authoritarian figure, of course, but he also implemented great modernization and westernization. And there was kind of a pushing away from the center of society, the religious aspects of Islam, and bringing in kind of secularism, which had was kind of a double-edged sword for the Assyrians. There was both um, a fear of assimilation into the larger society, and also but greater freedoms on the other hand. Iraq experienced a political shift in 1958 with the coming of Abdul Karim Qasim, moving towards republicanism. The king had been killed. There was a revolution in Iraq, and that transformed Iraq from a kind of a Western leaning country into a more center or more center left country. Both countries, it should be clear, focused on modernization and economic development. But of course, both countries had varied goals. Now, there was a religious and political impact. The Assyrians in Iran, although they were not all members of the Church of the East, looked to the Church of the East as kind of a leadership they placed the Patriarch of the Church of the East and the church's hierarchy in kind of a leadership position, symbolically, if not in actual fact. Under the Shah's regime, there was relative religious freedom. Assyrians were allowed to practice their faith, and I'm familiar with many Assyrians who had married non-Christian spouses who converted to Christianity. There are many examples. This was unlike Iraq. In Iraq, this did not happen. If it happened, the couple would have to escape the country, whereas in Iran, the situation was different. Now, the situation now in Iran, of course, is different, but during the Shah's time, there was much more freedom in terms of religious participation. Political participation was limited, but Assyrians were able to engage in political process. They became represented as a community along with others. Armenians and Jews also were represented. There was assimilation pressure during these times. And of course, we're going to try to understand the role that Rabi Addai Alkhas and Rabi John Alkhas played in this concern about assimilation. In looking at a theoretical background, I like to bring up Benedict Anderson, and you might say to yourself, why does he always bring up Benedict Anderson? Well, I bring up Benedict Anderson because he was a very important figure in trying to understand what nationalism is all about. And I just think he really had a lot to say, even though he didn't directly address the Assyrian situation. He had a lot to say about the way in which we should think about how a community, an imagined community, is formed. And I had asked you to keep this in mind when I talked about Benjamin Arsanis, Rabbi Benjamin Arsanis, and his admonitions and his poetry and his writings and his espousal of a history, a continuous history. And I ask you to do the same with Rabi Addai Alkhas and Rabi John Alkhas, think of the theoretical framework in which Benedict Anderson puts the formation of what he calls an imagined political community. Why does he say this word, imagined? He says it because he, as a social scientist, thinks that there's no way for a member of a national community, a nationality, an ethnicity, a nation to all to know each other. However, he thinks that through this imagination created by people who are involved in print literature, for example, people such as Rabi Addai Alkhas and John Alkhas, they make everyone aware of their connectedness to each other. So even though the Assyrians don't have a country, don't have a budget, don't have a military, do not have borders at this time, they have people like John Alkhas and Addai Alkhas who are going to tell them what keeps them together. Unlike, for example, in the case of a state, which enforces an educational system, they're going to do it through their periodical, which we're going to talk about, Gilgamesh. So that's all about Benedict Anderson. If you have questions at the end of this class, I'll be happy to answer. Just want to give you a theoretical framework for what we're going to talk about. So, and he also, of course, talks about the importance of print, what he calls print capitalism. This is very important for the formation of nationalism. And of course, Assyrians, Assyrian history becomes an anchor, a social, political anchor for the people, especially when we talk about ancient history, which, the various, it kind of digs deeper than all of the divided fragments of Assyrian society. So everyone is thinking along lines of, okay, we're all connected to this ancient people. Even if you are Presbyterian and I'm a member of the Church of the East and the other person's a Chaldean and the other person's a member of the Russian Orthodox Church and so on and so forth, we nevertheless, all of us are members of this one thing that goes deep into history and is great and is beautiful and is being, explained to us by people like Addai Alkhas and John Alkhas in this beautiful language that they're going to be sharing with us. So also within kind of the historical context of this is the role of an important institution. This is before the formation of political parties. So in 1948, the Church of the East announces through its leadership of Mar Ishe Shumon a shift in policy, whereas before it had been involved in trying to seek a collective solution to the Assyrian problem in the Middle East. In 1948, Mar Ishe Shimon, the patriarch of the Church of the East, said, okay, enough. We're not going to be doing this anymore. What we're going to be doing is engaging the countries of the Middle East, Iran, Syria, Iraq. We're going to have friendly relations with them, and we're going to try to work things out peacefully with them. And specifically with regard to Iran in 1951, there were 3 priests and 3 deacons consecrated, Qasha Pierre, Qasha Shmuel, Qasha Georgius. Now, why is this important? And then 3 deacons, Shamasha Haydun, Simon, and Ishe. Why is this important? Because the Church of the East also espoused a literary culture. The culture of the Church of the East is not just a religious culture, it is also a literary culture. So there is stress on language and custom and so on and so forth. So this is another factor in the cohesion of the Assyrian people in Iran. Although, as I said before, not everybody was members of the Church of the East. There were many who were Presbyterian and Catholic and so on, but they all looked to the Church of the East as kind of their ancient or original church. So there was a delegation that visited Iran in 1951 and 52, and Mari Shimon says it is the first time in the last 34 years that a representative of the patriarch has visited Urmia or Razaya at that time, and that we had received firsthand information regarding the situation of the church in that historic part of Iran, meaning the historic land that belonged to us. Now remember, in 1918, Mar Benjamin Shimon had been murdered by Simcoe in Salamis, and there were a number of church leaders, members of the Church of the East, who had been assassinated also. So this shift, this and then later the ordination of priest Hanania, who is later to become Bishop of Iran, whose picture you see here with the late this is the late Mardincha, Patriarch of the Church of the East, Mardincha IV, along with the late Honorable Homer Asherian, who was the representative of the Assyrians in the Iranian parliament, sitting and having a chat together sometime in the 1970s. So there was, this period was kind of a Assyrian community coming together again and kind of reshaping its existence. And it's within this context that the literature also becomes very important. And we see the formation of the ideas of people like Addai Alkhas and John Alkhas. And before we delve into that, I just want to say that there are two things to keep in mind when we talk about a people going over its past. There's tradition and there's history, and the two are different. And this is true of many societies. This is not exclusive, of course, to the Assyrians, but Maurice Halbach has said this with regard to the Jewish nationalist movement or Zionism. When tradition weakens and social memory is fading, history emerges as the primary mode of knowledge about the past. Think about that for a second when we talk about Rabi Addai Alkhas and John Alkhas. When traditions are fading, when we have fragmentation in Assyrian society, when we have persecution, dispersal, and alienation of Assyrians, think about the importance of history as some kind of an anchor, okay? So who was Rabi Addai Alkhas? He was born in 1896 in Urmia to an Assyrian family. He studied in Catholic schools. He was sent to Khosraw and Salamis to continue education. He studied Assyrian, French, Latin. He studied philosophy and theology. He taught in Urmi and Tabriz. He is, of course, the father, as we said, of Hanibal Alkhas, and he's also the brother of John Alkhas, who we are also going to discuss today. Now, like many Assyrians, he could not work exclusively in this field. This, this is a great tragedy, unfortunately, with many of our people. They cannot fully devote themselves to something, but what he created with his passion, if he was lacking in, let's say, the time, 24 hours a day, he couldn't focus on, he was actually working. What he created with his passion was something incredible, and he left the Assyrians a legacy that we're going to discuss. He passed away at the very young age of 63, and it was a great loss, of course, to the Assyrians. And what I think would be a greater loss is if the Assyrians themselves, forget the great Addai Alkhas, and we're going to talk about why. So he's important because in 1951, he founded a new printing house named Hunain. Hunain, of course, was the famous Assyrian translator and physician. He translated a lot of the works of Greek science into Syriac and then Arabic. And think about how interesting this is historically. Think about the languages that Addai Alkhas knew and his love of Hunain and his later awareness through understanding those languages, French and Latin and so on, understanding ancient Assyrian history, and bringing that to light to the Assyrians. And think about how Hunain Among other Assyrians during this time and members of the Church of the East, translated Greek science into Syriac, into our language, and then into Arabic. And many of these works, by the way, exist only in our language today. And historians are grateful for the translations provided by our ancestors of Greek science. So in 1952, he started this great treasure called Gilgamesh, the front cover of what you see here. And I'm going to explain a couple of things about these images that you see, which continued to run until 1961. So for a period of 9 years, it was lauded as the greatest literary production since 1845, since we started putting together our modern Assyrian language by no other than Nimrod Simono, who was one of our most learned and cherished teachers of the Assyrian language and thinkers, intellectuals. And he's also, of course, passed away. Gilgamesh became a, quote, literary tribune for Assyrian writers, not only in Iran, but in the whole world. That's true according to a Syriac specialist, Matsuh. And this is something that is recognized by all Assyrians who love their language and heritage. Who was John Alkhas? John Alkhas was the brother of Addai Alkhas. He was born in Urmia in 1907 and 1908. Both of their father was Binyamin Bar Usta Alkhas from the village of Elqe, who migrated from the mountains to Urmi, migrated, as I said, from likely from Al-Qush. And their family was martyred in, the last priest, his family was martyred in 1914. That was the father. Father and mother passed away at age 3. So John Alkhas and Addai Alkhas were two brothers that were orphaned during the Exodus and during the Assyrian genocide. After 1918, they studied in Catholic school in Tehran and Tabriz. He left Tabriz with his brother, was a member of the Assyrian Young Women and Men Association in Tabriz in 1925, and you'll see that in the photo next. In 1926, he studied under Marhab al-Zaya and Qashi Georgis Bibla of the Chaldean Church, traveled to India and obtained experience and education. In 1941, he worked with Marti Matius, Metropolitan of the Church of the East in India, to create the Assyrian alphabet, later used in Iran, which was used in Gilgamesh. In 1948, he helped introduce Assyrian printing letters. In 1952, along with his brother, he founded Hunain, in 1951, I should say, and in 1952, Gilgamesh came out. After his brother passed away in 1951, he remained in charge of Gilgamesh until 1961. And there you see John Alkhas, the lean and kind of lonely figure who had questioned everything about religion, about faith, about a lot of things, and who had an incredibly passionate affair with his ancient heritage. So this is in 1925. This is Assyrian Young Women's and Men's Association, Juanqe Khamate Al-Turaye in 1925 in Tabriz. Now, the use of what is being shown here, the images that you see are appearing for the first time to an Assyrian audience next to the printed Assyrian word. This is something very innovative. This is something very new. So you start seeing the Assyrian star, the winged bulls that were dug up from Nineveh 100 years earlier, and were now in the museums of the world and now are being linked to our culture and heritage. Whereas before, of course, these artworks, these symbols, these relics of a past that was lost to us in terms of collective memory were being brought back by Addai Alkhas and John Alkhas, and they were being brought back in a very forceful and beautiful way. So they used epics, poems, novels, and plays that showed a shared Assyrian past, common values, and also a collective destiny. They revived historical memories. They celebrated cultural uniqueness of the Assyrian people. We too, they were saying, have a cultural heritage, an important cultural heritage. Through literature, Assyrians articulate their aspirations, grievances, and ideologies, rallying people to the cause of national survival, self-determination. For some nations, the Assyrians were not, I stress this, and I differentiate between Assyrian nationalism and Assyrianism. Assyrianism espouses a cultural revival, a linking together of a people and linking these people back to the ancient past, rather than establishing political borders. So that's not what this effort was about. Literary figures became key players, such as John Alkhas and Addai Alkhas, using their writings to mobilize support and articulate the vision of the nation to assure survival. What was important was that we not lose our culture and heritage, and it is very important that we remember all of these things and we tell the tales of our ancient past. And Addai Alkhas tells us in the birth of Gilgamesh, we have thought for some time now that we should have a periodical in our own language, Blishanat Gyanan. In fact, if you look at the, let me just go back to this image, I meant to say something. Litcha Lishana, Litcha Lishana Humzimma, Hamzume, Cholia Achlishanat Yimma. This is to show the importance of the Assyrian language, and to see the Assyrian language written in this way and also linked to these very ancient symbols. Remember, whenever you see this language, this particular language, the usual association is with Christian symbolism. Now you're beginning to see ancient Assyrian symbolism linked with the modern Assyrian language. And this is something very innovative. And remember, when we talked about tradition versus history, this is now going into the area of history as tradition is fragmenting among the Assyrians. So he's telling us, tying us all together, this periodical in our language that serves as a link, tying us together, all literary abilities within our nation. This will help preserve and strengthen our language, which is our heritage passed down from our ancestors. We may with pride preach to the world that its civilization had begun with us, now going back to the ancient past. Don't forget, Assyrians, you're not just a Christian nation, you are an ancient nation, and the world should recognize that civilization began with us. Writings on tablets for thousands of years had been buried in the castles of their owners, have today risen from their graves and attest to this. It's a beautiful way of expressing how our ancient collective heritage had been lost to us, and we are gathering it again, and we are presenting it to you through these literary creations that we have. So who were the men behind Gilgamesh, this great literary effort, this retelling of the Assyrian story? It was created, of course, by Addai Alkhas, as we said, Rabi Addai Alkhas, along with John Alkhas and Nimrod Simono. Nimrod Simono, a very important literary figure. In addition, Zaya Bizaya, who passed away in 1972. The group succeeded in purifying the modern Assyrian of Turkish and Kurdish words. So there was an attempt to kind of pull out words which were clearly linked to other languages. And this purification, there's a whole study of how languages are quote unquote purified. And this is not just, of course, with Assyrians, there are others, but this is what they were doing in Gilgamesh. They were going back to the original words and expressions of the Assyrian people, creating what a Syriac specialist said, an elegant literary language. Others, of course, contributed: Mishael Bet Butros, Shmuel Bet Qolia, and Shlimun of Salamas, the great Shlimun of Salamas, very innovative writer. In addition to the normal context, glossary was devoted to the difficult words, khabre asqa. So there was always a discussion of like, let's go over these difficult words, awane, umta, so on and so forth. And this was very important to kind of go back to the original Assyrian language of, as Addai Alkhas said, of our forefathers. There was also a great deal of praise for great men of the nation. And the magazine began with a prayer for, it's called Sluta Qamillat Surieta. And of course, there's a lot of discussion of what does Aturaya mean and what does Suraya mean. We talked last week about the great Binyamin Arsanis and his stress on the word Aturaya. And there were also, there's this movement of adding kind of the alab and making it silent to the word Suryaya. And this came along in the late 1800s or early 1900s. There was this effort. So if you know Assyrian, you'll see Sluta Qamillat Suryeta is actually Asurieta. So you want to say Assyrian, not Syriac or Syrian. So the alab is silent, just as, for example, in know, to know, the K is silent. Here, the alab is silent. So this is a prayer by Martu Ma'odu for the Assyrian nation. And of course, Martu Ma'odu is one of those who believed that the Suryaye, as we called them, and some authors say, well, they are Syriacs or Syriac Christians. The Suryaye were, of course, Aturaye, were the same people as known as Aturaye. And this is a prayer: Lord of Lords, King of Kings, unchangeable and infinite, creator of all creations, knower of all sources, look with mercy upon our poor nation. Pour mercy upon the hearts of those who hate it. This is a powerful line. Pour mercy upon the hearts of those who hate us. Give blessings for our orchards and fields. Give us peace, serenity, and love for everyone, and more for each other. More for each other. Give us a pure heart and bright mind and good order. Give us strength and health. Now, this is a prayer that I think every nation could use, of course, but Martu Ma'odu is writing this prayer for his nation, and he, of course, is going to become a martyr in the First World War. Now, one of those things that was introduced to the audience of Gilgamesh and that became the source of poetry and a great deal of celebration was the ancient celebrations of the Assyrians. So there was a digging into the ancient myths or religious texts of the past, such as the Enuma Elish and the Epic of Gilgamesh. And there was now a study of, it's not just the Iranians and the Kurds that celebrate Nowruz. Our ancient ancestors did this long before, because there are now records of it. And we're reading the translations of our ancient cuneiform Akkadian language, translated by French and other Western authors, and now we're beginning to understand. So in the first issue, Nimrod Simono begins to tell the story of how the Assyrian and Babylonian New Year began, and compares this belief system sympathetically of the ancient Assyrians to the belief systems of modern Assyrians. This is something very significant. So no longer are the Assyrians simply chempe, or pagans who didn't know God and knew nothing of the system of belief. Now we're looking with more sympathy toward our ancestors and becoming understanding of their heritage. This outlines the significance of various days and prayer rituals, compares ancient Assyrian religious beliefs to ones that came after, Marduk versus Tiamat, similar to Yahweh versus Satan. And so, he tells us, from various perspectives, we find that the ancient civilization of our forefathers, our Hatan, remains a light whose rays have not yet dimmed. Wow. This is Nimrod Simono telling us that our civilization has not yet dimmed. Our ancient civilization, not just our Christian faith, but our ancient civilization. So they're adding this to what we already understand about ourselves, what we've been taught, of course, from our parents and our great parents and our great grandparents in maintaining our churches, our various churches. Now we look to see that we have a great civilization in our past. And now we're beginning in this magazine to see these images of, this is the march in front of the parade, in front of the New Year's parade in front of the Ishtar gate in Babylon. And Assyrians are looking at this and they're sort of imagining in the past, oh, this is our heritage. This is what we used to do as a people. This is very interesting. This is my history now. And also what the magazine did was say, well, the ancient past is, although it's ancient, it's not so distant. So let's become familiar with it. So there is a discussion of understanding all these terms, which were lost to us, of course, through the centuries. As these clay tablets became buried in the past, we lost touch, of course. The epic of Enuma Elish, we understood through this magazine new names, Ashur, Ishtar, Marduk, Tiamat. These were words that were kind of strange to us as Assyrians in the 1950s. Expressions in modern Assyrian language gave Assyrians a sense of their glorious past and gave them pride in their ancient heritage. Something very old, but something very new for us to know. Introduction to Ancient Assyrian and Babylonian History. Addai Alkhas wrote about this. John Alkhas, Nimrod Simono, and Zaya Bitzaya. Introduction of later epic tales such as Achiqar Hakima. So not only do we get to know our very ancient history, but now we're understanding our Christian history, poems and experiences of the First World War, now tying all of this history, all of this glorious past to the more modern past, the poems of Shlimun Salamas. There was children's poetry, news of Assyrians around the world, and pride in students doing well in school. So you see how all of this, the ancient past, the glorious past, the misery of the Assyrian people, everything is being tied together by Addai Alkhas and John Alkhas through this this magazine, this periodical. Now remember, this is before the internet. Of course, there's no internet at this time. So this becomes a very important source. Enuma Elish, the book of creation of Aturaya, as Addai Alkhas calls it, appears in 6, 7, 9, and 10 of the various issues. The tablets speak on the thoughts of Assyrians as to creation. Wow, I mean, you have to know the significance of this. This is very important. No longer are we just a religious minority. We're telling ourselves we're not just a ta'ifa or ta'ifa in Arabic. We are an ancient people. These were found by Sir Henry Layard and now in the British Museum. By the way, the early writers, Benjamin Arsanis and others, always gave credit to the works of Western archaeologists who came, dug up, took out material and took it to the West, but gave them credit for discovering this material. Introduced modern Assyrians to the names of gods and kings in the past. So nobody had ever before such writings heard in a popular way anyway, names like Diklat Palezar, Ashurbanipal, Sharukin, and so on, and Ishtar and Tiamat. Whoever heard of Tiamat? So this was all new to the Assyrians. So this is the first time that these writings of the ancient past begin to appear in the Assyrian language. Apsu, okay, the conflict with Apsu, the revenge of Tiamat, the battle between Marduk and Tiamat. All of these things are being written in modern Assyrian. All of these things are new. The missionaries who came to Urmia weren't interested in translating these things. Of course, even if they had them, their mission was different. But Addai Alkhas and John Alkhas felt this is knowledge that belongs to us, belongs to our people, and it ties us, it gives us an anchor as a people dispersed throughout the world, and it's important for us to know. And just to give you kind of a taste of how they did this also carefully writing the Assyrian in the Assyrian language. So it wasn't just a pure translation, it also gave meaning, and it also stylistically was beautiful. الهو أبرا اتمنى لت أرخل ديارة آلهت إشتر براتت آلهة سين متولا ناتو. It's very beautiful expressions in the Assyrian language, things we had not heard of before. And I want you, I can't overemphasize how new, even though this is very ancient, this is ancient stuff, but how new all this stuff was to the Assyrians. Alahta Ishtar, what are you talking about? The priests would say, the Christian priests among the Assyrians, what are you talking about? Alahta Ishtar, Bratit Allah Sin. What do you mean? There's no other God than the God that we know. You see, this is ancient, but it's also new. It's shockingly new to the Assyrians, but at the same time, Rabi Addai Alkhas and John Alkhas would say, well, but this is ancient literature. This is your past. So this is the story of the descent of Ishtar into the underworld, and this is the first time in 1955 that it's being expressed in the Assyrian language. And Assyrians begin to read this, and this is very, very interesting. And even though they do not, of course, not everyone becomes completely familiar. They become familiar with the names, not with the whole story. People don't go around reciting the story of the descent of Ishtar, but they become familiar with these expressions and names. Nirgal, for the first time. And Assyrians begin to name their children Nirgal. They become familiar with Sin and Ishtar and so on and so forth. And they become to grow, aware and respectful of their ancient heritage. So I don't need to go into the entire story here. This is not really important, but obviously this was just to kind of give you an idea of how fascinated Addai Alkhas was with this stuff, and his brother John. They were extremely fascinated with their ancient past, and they dug into this material with so much love and passion and dug up this stuff. And they also transmitted this to Addai transmitted this to his son Hanibal, who turned it into beautiful artistic words and expressions in his art and his poetry. And so we have it. All of us have it now. It's gone way past the area where they lived in Iran. It's gone into the entire world, and now it's a common expression to hear Ishtar. In fact, I think there was a ladies' circle here in Chicago called Ishtar Circle or something. And so this becomes a very popular thing. Another very important thing that was done is it was introducing various characters. So Addai Alkhas and John, but Addai in particular and Nimrod Simono introduced and honored people like William Daniel. William Daniel was honored by Addai Alkhas, and he tells us in one of the issues here, William Daniel was a man truly worthy of praise. He struggled for years for us. As a musician, well versed with his art, he could have worked for other nations. There was always, by the way, this sense of that we need to step up as a people. I think that's still among us today, that we need to do better. And Addai Alkhas here, decades ago, is telling us we Assyrians, other than some melodies and church hymns left for us in our churches, We have no songs to be sung at a party or wedding. And now, for the first time, we can take pride that we too have our songs. And so he's giving credit to William Daniel. So I say this because the magazine Gilgamesh, which Addai and John worked on, also helped give a platform to people like William Daniel and to praise them and to honor them and to press them forward. In Gilgamesh, there is a story written in 1953, a short story, just to give you kind of an idea of the expressions of these two men. John tells the story of in the winter of 1911 in a village in Urmia before Christmas when it's snowing and the river has frozen. He tells the story of a mother named Zarifa who sings a lullaby to her 6-month-old son named Sargon, who's in the Dargushta or in the cradle. And now this by itself is very innovative. The son named Sargon in the First World War. His father, Sando, has gone off to see his mother in another village, and he's been arrested at the command of an Assyrian priest, Gorlianos. He, because of the tension between the various Assyrian groups, and although there's tension between Zaripa and her in-laws, they all gather at her house to inform her that her husband, Sando, he has gone away and he's been arrested and they're not going to let him go. Friends come and relatives come to the aid of the household. So Zarifa and her son, Sargon. They proclaim, and this is kind of, the story is a very symbolic story. We young men and women swear upon our ancestors, Awahata, that we will not allow our churches to separate us into a variety of names. Prangaye, Amerikaye, Urusnaye, Inglisnaye, and so on and so forth. They're saying we're not going to let people divide us. We shall remain always Assyrian in blood, in citizenship Iranian, in faith Christians. Now, why are we saying Iranian? Assyrian in blood, Iranian in. Remember, the difference between Assyrian nationalism, as I've advocated or argued, and Assyrianism is a cultural matter, and this is what John Alkhas is stressing here. We're not looking for borders. We're looking to maintain our existence as Assyrians. Yes, we are part of Iran, but we are also Assyrian in blood, and we're not going to be divided along our church denominations. So this evil priest in the story appears to the family. He comes all of a sudden and he threatens them and he says, I will show you, and so on and so forth, unless you convert. Remember, this is 1911 to the Russian Orthodox Church. Unless you convert, Sando will not be released. So he's telling Zarifa and her family, he will not be released unless there's a conversion to the Russian Orthodox Church. And there were, of course, there's a whole argument about this, whether the Russian Orthodox Church pressured a lot of Assyrians to convert, and there was a large number of conversions, of course. Sando's father courageously objects. So he's kind of a heroic figure who says, I will not submit my Assyrianism, my Suryayuta. I will not lose my language. I will not lose my heritage. Do as you will. And suddenly, before everyone knows, the evil priest falls, and he falls to his death, falls in the snow, and he is taken away. And because the evil is gone, there's this expression, great is the God of Assyria. All the people say, great is the God of Sargon. This child who's growing up. This is expressed by Zarifa, and the rest say, great is the God of Assyria, or the snow continues to fall, but the family is hopeful that Sando will be released and Sargon will grow up to be a strong and Assyrian child nationalistically. And so this is the kind of story that is told, of course, in very beautiful Assyrian language, many times in Gilgamesh. And you see the symbolism here. The difficulty is portrayed in nature in terms of the snow and the hardship of people in winter, in addition to the hardship of the environment, the seasons. Assyrians are also dealing with fragmentation, but there is always hope. There is hope when you have wisdom and when you have courage. And that is what this Bulbala Pchabeta story, Quarrels in a House, written in 1953, means to express. So John Alkhas expressed Assyrianism as a force to be upheld through, excuse me, language, pride rising above denominationalism, as you saw in the story. There's pride in the struggle, Yukutasha. He shows us nature's beauty, as we will see, and nature's sorrow, and nature's difficulties. You saw in the story of the snow as it falls and the river is frozen, and people have a tough time to deal with the environment, and they're rising above that. There's a lot of longing and oneness that is important in his stories. There's always exile and overcoming. There's distance from home, distance from mother, distance from parents. There's loneliness in his plays. There's imagery and attention to detail. There's beautiful imagery in his expressions of poetry. He is the one who, by the way, writes for the very first time that the Assyrian New Year is celebrated 4,750 years ago. And so we have our, what you know as our Assyrian New Year. You have John Alkhas to thank for that, of course. And many people wrote about John Alkhas. They were fascinated with this character. He was really a very unique person. A very artistic, a very tragic person. One says, I met John Alkhas in Tabriz at that time in 1922. At that time, he was a student in the French Catholic mission. A number of Assyrians was great. There was great enthusiasm for nationalism at that time. More than now, this person says, among the young men and women. Next to the YMCA was a church structure for young people, and we created an organization open to all Assyrians. In this way, we created the Assyrian Young Men and Women's Association, and you saw that picture. And a conflict developed, as is common among us Assyrians, according to Baba George. And John Alkhas and William Sarmas, both of whom were Catholics, left and created another organization called Nasibis, or Nasibin. And this glimmered for some time and even opened a branch in Urmi. Pira Sarma says in his writings, it is implied and shown by John Alkhas that he was deprived of a family love because from a young age he lost his parents. And of course, yes, we see that in his expressions. We see that in his longing to reach back into the strength of his ancestors in ancient times, to kind of recreate this imagined family, if you will, in if we use the language of Benedict Anderson and others. The Assyrian calendar of the literary community in 1970 said, from this date of his parents' deaths, his brother and the late Addai Alkhas took it upon himself to be responsible for him and to raise him. So John Alkhas was raised by his older brother, Addai Alkhas, who's the father of Hanibal Alkhas, and he became like a father to him. And so again, to give you kind of an idea of the beautiful poetry of John Alkhas that was expressed in Gilgamesh. Without you, la diyuh, the evening with sorrow is pressed. Ramsha ile mkhishya khlisa. No star glitters. I feel my heart crushed, my soul with me rattling about her. I imagine the sorrow of mine as it spreads around my head, my heart, my head, and this bosom are tight with my love, are light with my love for her. I look upon the high skies like a Muslim during the fast of Ramadan. to break my fast at first light with her, but look, no moon in the sky and no sweet vision. Why have you hidden yourself from me, Lord, and left me to weep and sob without you and without her? So, very melancholy poem. He also looked at nature in a very symbolic way. Here he looks at the swallow, and I want you to see that he sees in the animal kingdom and in nature a picture of the Assyrian nation, and he wants to teach us something through this beautiful imagery that he puts together. Look at the swallow. Little by little it builds. Night and day it works unceasingly. The ant that is beneath your feet devotes to his own unceasingly. Like everybody works for their own, each to his own struggles and helps. Only you remain in this world yawning. So he's angry at the Assyrians who aren't doing enough. The dialect of she who bore you, Lu'za, Iddain Mubritokhila, little by little disappears from your listening. Let mashmuya, you don't listen to your mother. You're forgetting your heritage. At times, people call you by your faith. At times, people call you by your faith. Meaning what? Meaning you're no longer just an Assyrian, you are a member of a denomination. Let's see, tell me, who do you fear? Min manid buzdaya. Assyrian, why have you lost your daring? Jur'at qamut tulqo. Why have you lost your daring? Until when will you permit this hatred to your face? Awake, break, rise. Remember that you are an Assyrian and there is no fold that has no shepherd. Rise and devote yourself, work, build schools, so that in these your language will be protected from one generation to the next. You too will rise and allow your language and name to thrive, so that it would be happy with this. Those who raised you, so that Marat Nisan is your guide. In every land and every city, your protector be. In every land and in every city, your protector be. And again, awake, you who is an Assyrian, and do not praise the foreign doctor, who prophesizes that you are dead. So apparently he's come across those who say, well, there's no longer an Assyrian nation. Look, can't you see you are alive and you drink and you read? From beneath the avalanche, you have risen. You've been through some tough times, Assyrian, but you've risen. You are healthy with a passing temporary loss or illness. Your illness is temporary. Come, shake your slumber today. Think of the remembrance that is full. For this nation of yours and its future, upon you it depends. If from you there is a plea, the Lord will give blessings and forgiveness so that your nation escapes its winter. So it's constantly, these poems, these writings constantly urge the Assyrians to kind of stand up. Now, they're not rising in a political way. They're not rising in a violent way. There's no call for violence. There's a call to work, as he says, for schools, to educate, to create a stronger language, to create a greater sense of history, to uphold culture, and so on and so forth. Rise, awake, pick up your shovel, and do not fear what may come. Dig and water. And if you are tired, tell the girls and boys to come. There is hope for your labors. The skies will assist. So don't worry. If you put together the effort, then things will be okay, he is telling us. You whose date of birth is at this time is yearly held. Now he's talking to God, talking to Christ. As the millions great and little worship your kingdom, you spoke in Assyrian, Asura'it, and you wrote with your hand, come and do not ignore your kind, Tayyupuch. Is this not your right? Make that unity is initiated among us so that we do not here one day disappear, depart, and go. All right, I will just say a few more things here so we can wrap up. Um, so Nimrod Simono is a person that many Assyrians respected. I, of course, includes me, that we honored in the Assyrian Academic Society, and had him here in the United States, and he of course went back to Iran afterwards. And he tells us in his writings, and Nimrod Simono was a person who was also, in addition to being, in addition to loving his language and culture, was actually a very compassionate person, but also very realistic and very honest in his academic and scholarly studies. He tells us after 65 years, and I say this because he partly criticized John Alkhas when he came up with the Assyrian New Year, as to its accuracy and to the sources and so on and so forth. But he says, after 65 years, his image, meaning John's image, is before my eyes again. He was thin, tall, and handsome in his school uniform, clean and sharp. His forehead was high and thoughtful. His appearance olive-skinned with sharp eyes and sharp and rebellious eyes, and he had a small smile tucked in one side of his lips, so kind of an arrogant smile of sorts. I cannot recall if I had spoken with him, but I knew his friends, William Sarmas and John Luca, at the Hunain publishing house. He explained that he was not very keen on religious matters, confessions, prayer, and communion. As a Catholic, he should be, right? Nimrod Simono was. And he often received the rebuke lovingly from his master, Marha al-Zaya, who was aware of the skills of Little John, John Surah. And now, finally, this is a poem by the very moving and very sad poem by Hanibal Alkhas, Ya Mamuni Qatitani. Um, Uncle, tell me, tell me. And in this poem, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's such a beautiful poem. If you know Assyrian, please do read it. I think what I will do is I will record this in the Assyrian language, and read a translation of it later on. But basically, he's asking his uncle, why didn't you marry? Why didn't you have a girlfriend? Why didn't you enjoy treasures of this world? Why did you humble people who were arrogant, who were, so full of themselves? Why were you so humble, so uninterested in material things? And and then in the end, of course, he says, "Bitzeran ana," so I will take pride. Bitanin Rama, Ya Mamuna et Hanibal, O uncle of Hanibal, Muhibbit Umta Umanuta, beloved by the nation and by the arts. Mu'urcha Asqa Ladarruch. You never left the difficult road. So you took the difficult road. Hanibal is saying to his uncle. And I recall Hanibal talking to me about this poem that he wrote. He said, I had written a poem, Ya Mamuni Qatitani, and it is one of the most beautiful poems in the Assyrian language. I have said before that if you don't know Assyrian, one of the books that you should read and you should learn Assyrian for is Qatlina Gabbara by William Daniel. But I also think that the poems of Hanibal Alkhas and John Alkhas and the writings of Addai Alkhas are some of the most beautiful works of Assyrian literature that if you decide to read, if you decide to learn Assyrian, please don't miss going over these wonderful works. These are the sources that we used. In addition to, I just want to say that in addition to the stuff that we read, there were a lot of things, a lot of introductions of the works of Greeks. So Ninos and Shamiram, the story of Ninos and Shamiram, told by Diodorus of Sicily. Assyrians introduced it, tales of ancient Assyrian texts. And there's this beautiful expression or writing, almost like poetic writing by John Alkhas. He's saying, he's looking at his homeland with such reverence, such faith. O traveler, when you arrive here, meaning in Bitnahran in Assyria, to this plain of Bitnahran, be careful. For every step you take, you will touch the steps taken by persons 1, 3, 7, 9,000 years before Christ. And if you seek to go to the depths of history, you will find creation. O traveler, know that you have been created from this soil and its waters, as those who lived here were made of this soil, mixed with the blood of the gods. And so every step that you take, do it in silence and with honor. Very powerful stuff, very powerful stuff. So with this, I will stop and at the end just say what Gilgamesh did. It created a link between, so the work of Addai Alkhas and John Alkhas created a link between modern Assyrian language and ancient Assyrian words, names, and themes, stories, and history. It brought symbols, images, and scenes from ancient Assyrian past with modern Assyrian words. It made us familiar with a vocabulary that was unknown, and it was known only in scholarly circles in the West. It uplifted the confidence of the Assyrians after the devastation of their lands, their people, their culture, their history, and so on with the Assyrian genocide. It celebrated the culture of both modern and ancient Assyrians and linked them together. It strived to nativize the Assyrian language or purify it by teaching native words instead of foreign words, and it inspired a collective reawakening from their Assyrians as to their past.